Good morning. I want to start this keynote by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather. I pay respect to their elders, past and present, and recognize their enduring connection to country, culture, and community. And I also would like to thank our colleagues from the Australian Institute of Criminology for inviting me to Canberra. I like Canberra a lot, and what I like most about Canberra is what it means. It means meeting place. And this is exactly what we do today. We meet scientists, criminologists, but also law enforcement, all kinds of government agencies, policymakers, and also private industry. And I think that's very important also for research, for building our knowledge base, to collaborate and to work on the same data sometimes, and making policies that are really evidence-based. And this is very true also for organized crime policies, because organized crime, well, many people think about organized crime in a very primitive way. There are a lot of emotions, a lot of threats. They are there, they are real, but they often, often the media also, not the media over there, I mean media like films, we like to romanticize it. So what we know sometimes about organized crime is not from real scientific research, but what we believe or what we fear or what we see in the movies and in films. And now I will try to have the first slide here. I have to check whether this works. Yes. So the Godfather, for the older people here, no offense at all. I'm among you. The Godfather, Narcos, but also Breaking Bad. These are the ideas about criminal organization and what's organized crime about, that are very deeply ingrained in popular culture and also in political debates about organized crime. And what I want to do today is first start with 3 lessons we have learned from actual empirical research that is a little bit different from this. So 3 lessons we have learned about organized crime is that organized crime is embedded in social relationships. So yesterday already when we talked about human trafficking and also recruitment, we also found that social relations are very important. And today I'm not going to talk a lot about human trafficking because we did that yesterday. I will talk also a lot about drug trafficking because the Netherlands doesn't only produce tulips, flower bulbs, cheese, but we import and export a lot of illicit drugs also to Australia, so the ecstasy or MDMA in Australia, but also to other European countries. So a lot of Dutch offenders make a lot of profit by importing cocaine from Southern America and exporting it in Europe. But all types of drugs are exported in Europe, particularly to the United Kingdom, because there are also many Brits, I think, in the room. But the United Kingdom is actually a peripheral country in Europe. It's an island, so they have to get their drugs often from the continent, the mainland. And many drugs offenders make a lot of money by importing drugs, but also exporting all kinds of drugs, for instance, to the United Kingdom, but also to other countries in Europe. And if we talk about this, many people say this is business. And it is business, because you can earn a lot of money, but it's not a normal business. It's a business where the stakes are high, but all the regulations and all the formal mechanisms that are there in normal business cannot be used. You have no auction for drugs. You have no real prices. You have no contracts. You cannot pay via the regular system. So all you have to do is build trust with people you collaborate with, because sometimes you get into trouble. You cannot go to court. You cannot have arbitrage. So this is why offenders often use social relations to mitigate these risks of this business, but this illicit business. And that's why they use social relationships. So if you look at organized crime investigations, and we did that in the Netherlands for 30 years now. That's the Dutch Organized Crime Monitor. We analyze closed investigations on criminal groups. Time and again, we see that offenders collaborate with family members, friends, and they they introduce acquaintances to other acquaintances, and this is how it works. So social relationships are very important, sometimes the backbone of these criminal organizations. And some of these social relationships, they precede the criminal relationships, and they are also interconnected. And the last thing about social relationships is social relationships are dynamic. So here in this room, we're also a social network. Some people sitting at the same table, they are colleagues. They often sit together, but you also meet other people. So the network that is here today is a different network than yesterday. I met people, and this is also how it works in organized crime. These social relationships, they evolve over time, and that has consequences for two things. So the consequences I will talk about today is the consequences for the structure of criminal organizations and also for criminal careers and the social snowball effect. I will come back to that later. So let me first delve into three fallacies about organized crime. The first one is the mafia model. Organized crime research has been influenced a lot by American definitions of organized crime and also by Italian research, but also about the way in which organized crime is organized in Italy. In Italy, for instance, organized crime is longer than modern culture. It's about 1860 farmers, and the rise of organized crime there was focused on taking over government functions, ruling a small city or an area, and extract all the resources that are there. So actually, organizations like this, with a hierarchical structure and also with a sanction system, with people on the top, people at the bottom, they do exist, and we also find them in organized crime. But in Italy, you see that these types of organizations only function when they do these kinds of things. They control a territory, there's no government intervention, there's no legitimate government, and also they do specific types of things. They extract resources, they protect people, but at the same time, they get money out of them. And it's quite different if you compare this to trading networks, like drug trafficking. Trading and hierarchies, they don't fit very well. And you see that often in, for instance, the Netherlands. This is a far better picture of a criminal organization. These are criminal networks where people collaborate with each other, and some people are indeed more important than others. So you here see three big dots, and you see that in criminal organizations. Some people are more important than others, but you shouldn't ask the question, who is the boss? Because you can always say that somebody is the boss. You should ask the question, who is dependent on whom and for what reason? And if you look at organized crime, you see that these people that are important, they are the ones who have money, for instance. A lot of offenders don't have a lot of money. That's why they are in the business. Or they have a little bit of money and then they lose it. But the people who have the money, they can organize drug transports, they can invest in it. The people who have the contacts, so if you are in the Netherlands and you have contacts with Southern America with cocaine, you can organize a transport. So there are some people that are more important than others. And it's important to notice that, because also in policing, often we take people to court with a picture like this. We say, he's the boss or she's the boss, and this is how the organization look like. But in reality, often we see such types of groups. And the problem with the mafia model is that we freeze a picture of an organization, while in reality, it's a dynamic picture. And it also stimulates some naive ideas about how people are recruited. So if we look at the picture going back to this organization, we think if you are recruited for organized crime, then there is already an organization. They are looking for people down the bottom. So if you start a career here, you start at the bottom doing the dirty jobs, and then in the end you can be the boss. This is the traditional idea about recruitment. But if you look at organizations in this way, you can see that people can be drawn into organized crime in all kinds of ways, by all kinds of people. They can also use their own social relationships to get involved. And it's a far more dynamic picture. And that's why I will also explain that often we see in organized crime that we have a kind of social snowball effect. How do people get involved? Well, that's because of their social relationships, because they grow up in a criminal family, or that they have colleagues who are involved in organized crime, and they get into organized crime through these social relationships. Over a while, they get less dependent on their money, contacts, and resources, and then they develop their own criminal networks or criminal groups again. So it's a fluid picture, and it's no spaghetti. There is structure to it. So if you look at this network, you can say, well, what's the structure? Well, if we make the girls pink and the boys blue, you see actually there is a structure in this network. So the girls often, so this is a secondary school, but the girls often then socialize with the girls, the boys with the boys. And you see that the people that are in between there, they are very important to keep this network working. And you can say they broker between people in these networks. And that's what we see also in organized crime. Many of these networks have structural holes, especially if we talk about geography. So Australia and Europe, they are far away, but there are many British connections. So they are often brokers between these countries. There are also Dutch people. They broker between these countries. And they're also important to connect these networks, because geography means that you're far away from each other. It's not easy to connect to each other. And that's why these brokers are very important in these criminal networks. So the ecstasy production in the Netherlands and the ecstasy users or dealers in Australia, they need the brokers between these networks. So this is one possibility, geography. The other one is the licit and the illicit world. Some criminals have the problem that they know too many other criminals. But for organized crime, you need more than that. So if you want to beat up somebody, you have a lot of fellow criminals who can do that. That's no problem. But if you need to organize a transport of drugs, you really need an import-export company. You need to know how you do container shipping. And you also have to do something with the money, because people have to be paid. Well, often you see that also people who are brokers themselves, so they are criminals, but also they have a licit business, they are perfect to connect these networks. And also there are sometimes very interesting social relationships between people in the underworld and the upper world that drive these connections. So the second fallacy, also about criminal careers, is that we think that criminal careers is something about character. Some people are just criminals and others are not. And this is even more so if we talk about organized crime. Then people have to be very serious criminals and others not. So this is just a picture of a man that a colleague of mine wrote a biography about. And that's a biography of a lot of violence, and also a lot of violence in prison gangs. And this is the typical criminal that starts early, goes on for the rest of his life. And you see also the tattoo, born to make shit. He also acknowledges himself that this is how his world looked like. But if we look at Dutch offenders in the big drug and also the fraud investigations, we see totally different types of people. So on the left-hand side, on the upper-hand side, you see one of the suspects in one of the biggest fraud cases in the Netherlands. Well, at high school, he was the perfect student. And in the end, he became one of the main suspects in a big fraud investment case. Further down below, is a shady entrepreneur, which is very typical of many criminal investigations we see in big cities. There you see that sometimes shady entrepreneurs with connections with drugs, they also are big investors in, for instance, cafes or hotels, or in the Netherlands, prostitution and cannabis outlets. But at the same time, this man, he was the biggest investor in the red light district of Amsterdam. And he also was a perfect businessman. If you talked about health and safety regulations, he was in compliance with everything. But at the same time, he had a lot of drug connections. You see also there a real estate broker and a criminal. And the criminal was really a friend of his. He got a lot of money out of him, and below you see the money launderer. And this money launderer looks really like, well, the typical banking or investment banker. He was also in high regard. He had a castle. He had a good taste for art and wine. And also our former EU Commissioner, Kroes from the Netherlands, she resided in the same castle because he was really, well, until he was arrested for money laundering, he was really above all, beyond all suspicion. So we have to really think again about what we really know about criminal careers, because much of the research that is done in criminology, and my excuse for the criminologists, but some part of criminology is really focused on the least important offenders and the least important types of crime. This is not true for the organized crime researchers, but you will see that a lot of research is focused on adolescents and adolescent offending, and we know a lot about that. And we also know a little bit more about frequent offenders, so people like the person I talked about that start early and then continue along a life of crime. But we don't know a lot about the criminal careers, for instance, of big organized crime offenders or fraudsters, because many criminologists don't have access to data. And that's why I think it's very important that we collaborate, police agencies and also academics, to use these data to get a good picture of how this works, because we don't know a lot about it. The first reason is that these more serious forms of crime, these serious offenders, they don't fill out questionnaires. So they drop out of all these studies, and you only can know something about it if we use the knowledge that is gained through criminal investigations. And often these criminal investigations only have one goal: to convict the offenders. And then the rest is, well, it's in the archives. And you really should give access to researchers to do something more about it. We call it intelligence sometimes in policing, but there's also intelligence just about how do these things work, and are they actually the same as the stories we tell each other about how this works. So if we talk about the adolescents and life course persistent offenders, the story is quite simple. It's the story about the little angels painted by Raphael. So we're all little angels, and also little angels, if they get a little bit older, if they are 15 or 17 years old, they go to Amsterdam, they drink something, they smoke something, and they get into trouble. I think that Ella said that she did a lot of crazy things when she was young. I think that's true for all of us. But this is the idea about the adolescent limited offenders. It's just part of the teenage years when your brains are still developing. There are no brakes on your behavior. And it disappears like snow in summer. If people get old, they drop out of crime. And that's the story about the adolescent limited offenders. And there's only one type of offender that's not part of this journey, and that's the persistent offender. And there you see that for a long time we have thought about this in terms of character, that there are some people who are born criminals, or they have certain characteristics that develop early in life and that will make them continue along the path of crime because there's some deficiency about it. And this is what we actually do. We now think it's strange if we measure noses or skulls, but actually we do the same in some of the research. We try to find some stable characteristics that are different for frequent offenders from the normal population. And my message today is that many of the organized crime offenders, they are similar to us. They have some of them have particular characteristics, but if we think all of them have these particular characteristics, we don't see a lot of these offenders. They can be bankers, and they can be normal businessmen. And if you look at the world like this, like there are stable characteristics that define your career in crime, you can see that you cannot accept the fact that people later on in life can also start in crime. And this is one of the messages of today. In organized crime research, we see that many criminal careers some of the careers start early, and I will talk about that as well, but more than half of it, they start at a late age. So adult onset, we call this, and many people think that cannot exist. And in research we have found this, and for a long time people deny that. And that's true for many things. And this is an example from the sciences. The curious case of adult onset can be compared to what Dan Shechtman found with the crystals he investigated. He got a Nobel Prize for it, but crystals are often periodic. There is a system in it, and he saw something different. These are quasi-periodic crystals. So there's a pattern, but it's not regular, but it's quasi-periodic. And he got ridiculed by his colleagues. His boss even gave him a basic chemistry book. He said, read it, it's nonsense. There's no such thing as quasi-crystals. There's only something like quasi-scientists, like you. And he was sacked. But his sweet revenge was he got a Nobel Prize. But this is what often happens if we see an anomaly, something that is different from what we think there should be. We don't see it because we are too preoccupied with our own ideas. If we see it, we don't believe it, or we disregard it. And this is what I'm going to talk about today, about adult onset, what we know about it, criminal careers, and also how people get involved in organized crime. So I'll also talk a little bit more about involvement mechanisms, like the social embeddedness and all kinds of involvement mechanisms, also about criminal families, about work and professions, and in the end I will also focus on some new issues in this type of research and also policy issues that are connected to the discussion about criminal careers in organized crime. So what we see in the research that has been done over the years in various countries, including Australia, is that we find very similar conclusions about criminal careers in organized crime in these different countries with different definitions about organized crime. Some people start discussing organized crime. What's the definition of organized crime? Well, I could have a lecture or I could lecture the whole day about it. But it's different in many countries. And also the type of organized crime is sometimes different. So Italy and the Netherlands are very different. So in Italy you have these long established groups that sometimes control regions. In the Netherlands we have more trading, so drug trafficking, transnational drug trafficking as a very important driver of organized crime. Well, in the United Kingdom you have different organized crime problems, and in Australia you also have your own definitions also. And what is interesting about these types of research that have been done over the years is that in these various countries we find very similar conclusions based on different definitions, sometimes quite similar, but also different ways of having a sample of organized crime offenders. So, for instance, in the Netherlands, we use these closed investigations. So that's hard evidence that these people are actually involved in organized crime. In the United Kingdom, they used an offender database. In Italy, they had a mafia membership data set. And in Australia, they used intelligence. So these are different ways of getting to a population of offenders. And the interesting thing is that we find very similar conclusions. And one of them is adult onset, that people start late in organized crime. Sometimes the average age is 27 years. Well, that's something different than the teenage years. And some of these offenders are really quite old. They are in their 50s or 60s and still involved in organized crime. And that's also a reason why this is not so strange, because organized crime or transnational organized crime, and especially trading and trafficking, it's quite different from normal crime. Because if we think about high volume crime, anybody in this room could steal my telephone. You don't need special expertise. So that's why you never should leave your phone somewhere. And everybody can get into a fight. I hope not today, but you don't need, and that's why the reason why young children, and if there are some differences sometimes in temperament, you can see that in their criminal careers. But that's not true about organized crime, because for organized crime you don't, well, you need special relationships and special qualities sometimes. So there are three things in which organized crime, and especially this transnational drug trafficking, diverges from normal high-volume crime. And the first one is the importance of social relationships, and also having social relationships the right way. So, for instance, transnational social relationships, and you have to build something up. So the second aspect is it's transnational, so in terms of social relationships it's difficult, but also in terms of the logistics. You have to ship a container from A to B, not through the Strait of Hormuz, which is really difficult at the moment, but also normal shipping can be done not by anybody. You need a company, or you need to know somebody with a company, and you also need to do the payments. So it's logistically far more complex than street crime, and you also need to involve more co-offenders. And what does this mean for criminal careers? I think it means that the social opportunity structure is very important, and social opportunity structure means that not everybody has access to organized crime, and that your social relationships, they give you access to organized crime. And these opportunities are not the same for everybody. So the first unequal distribution is within our population. Some people are far better positioned. So if you have transnational ties, you are far better positioned for a career in organized crime. If you're born in a criminal family, you're far better positioned. And also if you have a typical profession, you are far better positioned for organized crime. So if you are working in the import-export business, or if you're working in a harbor or in an airport, I will talk about this a little bit later, but that's the perfect job to get involved in organized crime. And the second issue is that there's an unequal distribution across age. So politicians and also police men and women, they are very concerned nowadays in the Netherlands, but also perhaps in Australia, about the involvement of young people in organized crime. Well, some of these young people get involved in organized crime, they get recruited, but for most of the organized crime offenders, young people are not that very interesting. They can do some high-risk jobs, but they don't even have a driving license. They have no company at all, and if you get older, you get more contacts and also more possibilities to get involved. So that's why we see that often older offenders, also at a later age, they get involved in organized crime and not the young people. So that's what also explains this typical problem of the adult onset. So people, you don't expect they get involved in organized crime, but they do. And they were perhaps normal businessmen or working in a harbor, but get involved in organized crime. Let me tell you something about the Dutch Organized Crime Monitor. We now celebrate the 30 years anniversary of this monitor. It started in 1996, and up till now we have investigated more or less 200 or 169 big cases of organized crime. But the research I'm now going to talk about is about 180 closed investigations and about 2,000 offenders. And we already, in an early age, got some results from that, and we keep on doing research on that. But one of the basic conclusions of the first studies were already, these are particularly older offenders. Youth is underrepresented, and the average age was 27 years old. So that's quite different from the view that many people had. And this is similar in many other countries. We also saw various offending trajectories. So I talk a lot about this adult onset because we could not expect that and could not explain that. And I think we can explain it now. Of course, you also have people who start early, and I will talk also about them. But these trajectories vary. And there are also differences between these early onset offenders and the adult onset offenders. Some people say, well, this adult onset might be an artifact. So this is one of the ways to explain this away. And they say, well, they are just very intelligent offenders. They are intelligent from an early age on. They are very shrewd, so they don't show up in the databases of the police. Well, I think the basic question is there any reason why these organized crime offenders, if you talk about high volume crime, so property crime, getting into a fight, they would have a substantial higher or lower arrest risk? Well, I see no particular reason why that should be the case. So I think adult onset is real. This is the first argument. The second argument is that we did a lot of analysis on these offenders and also tried to figure out whether there were differences in these criminal careers if you compare, for instance, leaders of criminal organization or the big bosses and also the lower level suspects. And we saw late onset offenders in both groups. So it's not something that can be explained by very shrewd leaders or very dumb lower level personnel. And we did the same by comparing drug offenders and fraud offenders. So some people say fraud offenders, they are very intelligent, but fraud offenders are sometimes also normal criminals, sometimes early onset offenders, but you also have late onset there. So actually we see adult onset everywhere. The third argument why it's not an artifact is that you see in qualitative research, so if you read biographies, the life histories of people, they tell themselves how they got involved at a later age in organized crime. And also in our criminal investigations, you have the interrogation of suspects, and sometimes it's very clear that people start at a later age. So it's real. And of course, the last argument is that you see in various countries with different types of organized crime problems, you see very similar conclusions. So what are now the main differences with high volume crime? Well, generally, the population in organized crime is older and juveniles are underrepresented. So in property crime, you see a lot of juveniles, but in organized crime, well, the juveniles that are there, they are not that young anymore. And I will tell you later on that the typical age when we talk about youngsters getting more involved in organized crime is not their teenage years, but it's more in their 20s or late 20s. These offenders they do have more previous judicial contacts and also more serious contacts. They have a relatively late onset in the adult years, and we see different career patterns. So we definitely also see these early onset offenders next to the late onset offenders. And there are differences between these groups, especially in terms of education, work, criminal profile. Roughly, people who start early have less education, more often unemployed, and also have a more criminal profile. How do you get involved in organized crime? Well, there are 5 involvement mechanisms, and we often talk about the last one, deliberate recruitment. So there's a criminal organization, they're looking for somebody, and they recruit somebody. Well, this happens, but often this is also a two-way street. Some people also offer their qualities to several criminal organizations. But the basic idea how you get involved is social ties. So family, friends, acquaintances, they get you involved in organized crime, and you introduce then people to other parties. And especially growing up in a criminal family, I will tell you something more about it in the next slide. This significantly raises the risk of getting involved in organized crime. The second aspect of organized crime involvement is work ties. So at our age, we spend more time with colleagues sometimes than with our own family. And work ties are also social ties. And especially in logistical hubs like the harbor or airports, there are all types of professions that go from land side to air side. So we talk about pilots, we talk about stewards, stewardesses, but we also talk about baggage handlers, catering, waste, all the professions that are there. Basically, people are able to enter or cross the border on a daily basis, and they know how to do it, so they are perfectly positioned to smuggle drugs. So these work ties are also very important for opportunities in organized crime. And work also means social contacts. So also ex-employees, we often see them, they have their connections with the airport or with the harbor. They know how it works a little bit. And this is also how this connection is there between work ties and social ties. A third mechanism we see is leisure activities and sidelines. So some people never meet, but if you go to the nightlife, there are people from all kinds of backgrounds that have a party together or just visit the same cafe. And sometimes connections start that way. These are social connections, but they sometimes connect underworld and upper world, and sometimes it's a real friendship, but it's driven by leisure activities. And some leisure activities are, perhaps there are people who ride a motorcycle, but we often see that the motorcycle clubs, people are there not because because they like the motorcycle. So there are friendships between people, and this is also true for soccer games. Well, you look perhaps more to, I don't know what happens at cricket, but at soccer games, you see that many people, they support the same club, they are there every week. These are social connections, but these are social connections between people from totally different backgrounds. And that's very interesting for organized crime. And sometimes these are real friendships that make something happen that otherwise would not happen at all. The fourth mechanism is live events. In life course criminology, we know that some live events have a very positive effect on dropping out of crime. So getting a stable relationship, getting stable work, getting children, it all means that you don't have time for anything more, and not at all for crime. So many men drop out of crime because of these life changes. They get a stable relationship, they get a stable job, and also if they get children, they get other responsibilities, and that's very important mechanisms. But here we see the opposite, perhaps, that if you have a business, the bank pays for everything. But if you run into troubles, then you have your car and you have your beautiful house, you cannot pay it, and the story goes, or the song goes, nobody knows you when you're down and out. But if you're down and out and you have a business, you actually have a lot of friends from organized crime who want to invest a little bit, save your life, save your luxury life. So often we see that people who have financial setbacks, they make different decisions than they did earlier in their life. So many of the businessmen who get into trouble, sometimes they make later in their life different decisions. And sometimes it's also part of a life event, like they get divorced, they go live somewhere else, they go to meet old friends. And these old friends are doing different things at that time. So these life events are, and especially the ones including financial setbacks, they are an important mechanism we see in our files. Well, let's go back to the criminal families. We did a research study of 4 years into criminal families. And one of the parts of that study was to look at all the organized crime offenders that were convicted, 87 convicted organized crime offenders, and look at all the children of these organized crime offenders and ask the question, what happened to their criminal career? And there we saw a lot of continuity. So about 60% of the sons, well, they also had a criminal record. So it's not good to start in a criminal family, or especially an organized crime criminal family, because 60% of these boys, they continue along the path of crime. The daughters did much better, only 30%, and also we saw that the sons had far more serious crimes than the daughters. So daughters always do better, perhaps, but in organized crime, they did better. We also saw that some of the children of especially female organized crime offenders, it's about 10% of the population, or 10 to 15% of the population is female offenders. We saw that if your mother is an organized crime offender, we saw that these children had a significantly higher risk. And that's because some of these organized crime families, the mothers sometimes have a lot of trouble keeping these families alive and kicking, but they manage. And especially if the female or the mothers are also involved in organized crime, we see there's something different about these families. Perhaps that explains a significantly higher risk for these children. But the most important part of this study was that we compared this group with a comparison group of children that were quite similar in terms of age, sex, but also socioeconomic background. And there we saw that the relative risk of people born in a criminal family or an organized crime family were much higher. So 3 times higher for criminal behavior in general, but 10 times higher for drug trafficking and drug-related offenders. So that's a significantly higher risk. And this is also what you see in some police investigations. But we also have to take notice of the fact that this does not apply to all these children. And this is sometimes also the problem with these criminal family investigations, that you investigate a lot of people, you are worried about a lot of children, but actually a small part of them continue along the path of crime. Well, work and employment. The literature on work and employment concerning crime is a little bit mixed. So sometimes we find studies that conclude that unemployed or unemployment, it drives crime. But on the other hand, it's not always the case, and especially the discussion here is about the quality of work. So some young people, they have a job, but this is not a stable job. This is a temporary job, low-skilled, highly volatile, and these types of work don't prevent crime. So this is a mixed finding we see in the literature on work and crime. If we look at organized crime, we also see mixed findings. So for instance, in Italy, we see that unemployment rates, especially in peripheral regions in Italy, because in Italy the mafia is strongest in the poorest states, the southern states, and there's also high employment. And you see there that this high employment also is good for the manpower of organized crime organizations. In the Netherlands, we see something different. The Netherlands is a thriving economy, I think, not a lot of unemployment, but here we see that especially certain professions, they are connected, they have a positive effect on organized crime opportunities, and especially work in the logistical sector. So one of the things we did with the Dutch Organized Crime Monitor research is look at all the professions that were there in the histories of the organized crime offenders. And we saw two typical features of these professions. The first was that many of these people were involved in mobility, transport, and logistics. So working as a baggage handler, which is not a high-skilled job, it was very much connected to the way in which drugs are trafficked through the Netherlands. So many people don't stop in the Netherlands. These are flights flying into Schiphol Airport, Amsterdam Airport, and then they, in the baggage handler's basement, you take out the drugs from the suitcases and you just smuggle it into the country. This is a very basic idea, and this is also true for containers in the Rotterdam harbor. You get into, and that's increasingly difficult, and that is also why perhaps cocaine trafficking is a little bit down in the Rotterdam harbor. In the past it was very easy to enter a harbor and go out, but you enter the harbor, you go to the container, you get the cocaine out of the container, and you've trafficked the drugs. So many people that are connected to mobility, transport, and logistics, and the same is true for truck drivers, but also for people who are in import and export. They know how to do it, and they have the opportunity to get involved in organized crime. So we see particularly these types of professions in organized crime. And the second one is autonomy and freedom of movement. We hardly ever see civil servants in our files, because they are not corrupt. No, there are corrupt civil servants. But many of these professions, they have a kind of autonomy. So if we talk about businesses, often these are family businesses, small businesses, just one man, a couple of people, just one bookkeeper, very small independent businessmen or small businesses. They are typical in our files, and I think the reason is that it's far easier to connect legal work and illegal work and legal bookkeepers and illegal bookkeepers if you are a small company. So that's also something typical we see. Let me briefly tell you also something about not the adult onset offenders, but the people who make a career in organized crime. We talked about half of the offenders being adult onset offenders. The other half is early career offender. They start early. How do they get involved? How do they grow also in organized crime? Well, we see first that it's the later stages of life. So in their 20s and 30s, early 30s, we see that some of the people, they make the transition to really organized crime and making a lot of money out of it. So it's not the young people, it's a little bit older. We also see in many local investigations, so cities dealing with their own problems, that we saw a lot of organized crime offenders that we could describe as local heroes. So they have a lot of contacts, they live there for a long time, so they know a lot of people, but they're not that interesting to other offenders in other countries or other regions. They are typically doing a lot of things, they are general offenders, and they use their contacts to do that. So that's why we call them local heroes. Some other offenders, they have more contacts with other countries, and that's why they can make more profits. And that's what we see, that they sometimes specialize in a certain connection. So for instance, Dutch offenders trafficking all kinds of drugs to the United Kingdom. That's a way in which you can specialize, in which you can earn a lot of money. And they just use their contacts to do that. And they're also interesting for British offenders. They come to the Netherlands, they buy their drugs there. And also some Italian offenders, they come to the Netherlands to buy their drugs there. Sometimes it's also possible because of the connections of others to do that. So we also have examples for people who live in the south of the Netherlands in a small village. They never leave the village, but they have the contacts. They produce ecstasy. They get the ecstasy out through brokers in the Netherlands, and they also get the cocaine in without ever leaving, or, well, this is an exaggeration, but hardly leaving their own hometown. There are three mechanisms we see in these careers that we can call growth mechanisms. I think context and expertise are very important. We haven't talked a lot about facilitators, but if you look at criminal networks, you can also see that there are certain people who have very specific expertise that is sought after by many other offenders. So in ecstasy production, it's often people getting the precursors or getting all kinds of hardware you need to produce this. And there you see that it's not only their quality, but it's the network around them that drives their criminal career. By word of mouth, other offenders, they contact these people and they, or if you are a transporter, you transport to the United Kingdom, you do that successfully. You see, and a lot of groups ask you to do it for them. So actually, it's the mechanism of the network around these people that drives their career and give it a boost. And this is also true of the money exchangers or the money launderers or the underground bankers. You also see many offenders have the same problem. They have the money, but it is in the wrong place or it's in the wrong currency. It's in British pounds or even Scottish pounds, 10-pound notes. What do you do with it? Well, there are people who can take care of that. We can call them underground bankers, money launderers. But they're in high demand by many offenders because they face the same problems. A second mechanism we see is capital accumulation. Many offenders have little money or they get broke every time. And the ones who accumulate capital, they have a big advantage because they can take on different roles. They can let other people smuggle the drugs and stay have a lower risk of arrest. And there are also all kinds of economy of scale. If it works well, you can invest more, you make more profits, or if there is often the money or the drugs also get seized. But if you have a lot of money, that's not a problem. You can run this business better if you have a lot of money. And the third mechanism is some of these people, they get to the background more and more. So they invest their money not only in drug transport, but later on in semi-legal business. This is the story of the Amsterdam red light district, where a lot of these people invested their money in cannabis outlets. We call them coffee shops, but they don't sell, well, they sell coffee, but they don't sell alcohol. That's why they're called coffee shops. But the cannabis outlets were condoned in the Netherlands. They were a very good investment because normal investors, they didn't do that. And also prostitution, but criminal investors, they had a big market there. They took over a lot of these brothels and also coffee shops. They started them. And this means that they get kind of semi-legal income. And if this takes some years, it's often not possible anymore for the tax service or for the police to say, well, you're a criminal. No, you're a legal businessman then. And the same is true for cafes and bars and restaurants and also hotels. They are high cash industries. And it's easy to invest and start this and get some legal income out of it. And for the police, the main problem is that these people became background operators. They still had a criminal context. It was hard to get them. Well, the last two slides are about new issues in research and also policy issues. So new issues in research is when and where we are. So I talked already about the character trap. So about the fact that we think criminal careers are driven by certain specific characteristics. Well, we should actually do a lot more research also in comparing countries and also cohorts. The first study we did was comparing the Netherlands and Italy and also cohorts, so older offenders and younger offenders in the Netherlands. And you see that sometimes there are similarities, but also differences between countries that have to do with the type of crime that is there, and also between cohorts. It makes a lot of, I think for Australia, it's very interesting to see what happens to the organized crime offenders or the people who step into the business of illicit cigarette smuggling. It's a particular period in Australian history when this window of opportunity for criminal opens. And the same was true in the Netherlands. We have cohorts of offenders that started with cannabis smuggling when it was condoned in the Netherlands and not in other countries. So they really had a head start in transnational cannabis trafficking. And the same was true with ecstasy production, where it was also, well, it was not legal, but it was not enforced because in the Netherlands we try to protect consumers, and it's very hard to protect consumers, do pill testing at ecstasy parties, and also have a lot of dance music and Dutch DJs and big events, and then say, well, the youngsters should be safe, there should be drug testing, there should be cooling down areas, we should invest in that, and at the same time arresting everybody. That's quite difficult. So the Netherlands only stepped up against drug production in ecstasy when actually the United States said you should do something about it, and otherwise you're on our blacklist, the same as Colombia. And then the Netherlands did something else. So they made an effort to do something about it. So when and where we are is very important, and we should do more research comparing countries and also cohorts. A second issue that is very important in the Netherlands is now young offenders and involvement in organized crime. We've always been concerned about that. So in 1996, when the Organized Crime Monitor started, we had the same discussion about recruitment of youngsters. It's there, it happens. I think then it was not a big issue. That was also the research. But now we have the same discussion, and it's perhaps wrong to think, well, it's wrong. It's not a real issue again, because it's really an issue in two types of high-risk jobs in the Netherlands. The first one is getting cocaine out of containers. Often this is done by crews, and you see that in these crews, sometimes also there are very young offenders, teenagers, but also there are also older offenders. So I think this high-risk job is really an issue. And the second one is explosives in the Netherlands. You have your fire bombs. We have professional fireworks that we use at New Year's Eve also, but actually that's an explosive, and it's manufactured legally in Italy. Cobra 6 is called. You can buy it on the internet, very cheap. Many people can get it, and all the youngsters in the Netherlands know how to fire it, because it's not that difficult. And that's used to threaten people, and not only in organized crime, but also in social conflicts. So we have a surge of these explosives, often in apartment flats, and then there's a lot of public concern about it, but also public concern about these young offenders. And we actually have a big project on that. So it's called EPIC, not Epic Fury. It's EPIC, explaining and preventing youth involvement in organized crime. And actually we have 5 PhDs and 2 postdocs working on it, on how young people get involved, but also the interventions that are typically used, because a lot of government's money is spent to cities to do something about it. And I think something has changed, and that's this third line of research we're doing now. The internet, social media, and new ways of access to organized crime and recruitment, and especially for these types of crimes, often it was difficult for youngsters to get into contact with organized crime. But now with social media, it's far easier, and we see from this research that it's used, well, often people talk about Telegram, but also Snapchat. That's typically used by youngsters in the Netherlands. And it feels kind of safe, because you think messages, they vanish, they don't. So a lot of police investigations, for instance, they have focused on seizing the telephones of youngsters and then decrypting it. And that's very interesting material for criminological research because you actually can see how the conversation is. And there we see something interesting. First, it's very easy to have very vague advertisements. So it's about fast money, but also messages like, do you want to jump on the boat? And then I would think, well, what boat, what are we going to do? But then there's always the direct messaging, and then you know what it's about. And often it's about high-risk jobs for 200 to 500 euros, so 400 to 1,000 Australian dollars, I think, more or less. So not a lot of money, but for young people who want to have a party in the weekend, it's actually good money. So you see that for these high-risk jobs, these social media really make a difference because it makes it very easy for people to contract out these high-risk jobs and also for young people to get into contact with them. Well, let's go to some of the policy issues that are connected to criminal careers and organized crime. Well, the first difficult issue is about individual offenders or groups. Should you focus on that and should you take a law enforcement perspective? What we see in these big criminal investigations is that actually it's quite difficult and also quite costly. So many of these investigations, they take at least 2 years to accomplish with a team of 10 to 20 investigating police officers. So it's quite expensive. And we also see that some of the interventions that are focused on individuals, like youngsters, they're also quite expensive. So often we have a top 100 and then you target with youth workers the most problematic people, but also the most problematic youngsters. The rate of success is also not that high, and also it costs a lot of money. And so there's also the discussion about should we change offenders, should we lock them up or focus on prevention, but also shouldn't we have a look more on situational prevention. It's quite difficult in organized crime because organized crime offenders, they can find their way. But if you look in these criminal investigations, often you see things that can make a difference. And that sometimes they ask some courage from policymakers and politicians also to do something about it. Because sometimes you see that the people change, but the circumstances under which it's so easy to do this, they stay the same. And this was, for instance, true for the airports and also the ports of Rotterdam. We can talk about that safety is a common issue, so we are all in this together. This is true. But the economic benefits and the costs, they are different. So what we saw in the Rotterdam harbor, that many companies were not interested in all in drug trafficking and controls because you can check everything. But that's, time is money. And this is true at the airport. You cannot check these planes or the passengers. The Netherlands earns money by being the harbor and also the airport of Europe. So you saw that many of the interventions you could do, they have a cost for private companies. And sometimes you really need to incentivize them to do something. And in the Rotterdam harbor, they did that in the end. And I think it shows a little bit that cocaine trafficking is down, but Antwerp, which is a harbor quite close to Rotterdam, and it's actually also part of the Netherlands, more or less, according to offenders. So it doesn't make a lot of difference. They actually also have a problem with cocaine trafficking. So you also have to take care of these side effects. A second issue in politics and policy issues is early intervention versus adult onset. Some people say you should save children from a life of crime, so you should intervene very early. But one of the problems is that if you intervene, you should know that it's actually preventing a life in crime. Well, for organized crime, you don't know that for sure, because many people start later on. So I think one of the big issues for criminal careers in organized crime is how do you flag these people that are older and start in organized crime, because they are not in the data of the police, they are not the usual suspects, and you need other types of information to focus on that. And the third difficult question is about career criminals and background operators. So people who have invested a lot in real estate, bars and restaurants, and their criminal connections and their criminal money is now invested in economy. It's quite hard to target them. So my main conclusion for today is tackling organized crime is hard, but not impossible. If we use the best of our knowledge possible and keep the connection between science, law enforcement, and policymakers alive and kicking. And that's what we are doing today. So thank you for your attention.